Okay, welcome to the IAS Nobel Series lectures. Today we're very pleased to have Sujata Visaria from the Economics Department to speak on the Nobel Laureate in Economics this year, Angus Deaton of Princeton University. Sujata graduated from Columbia University, and she is now Assistant Professor of Economics in the Department of Economics. Her research area is development economics, and she'll share with us what Angus Deaton's work is about and her personal interaction. And so I'll give the time to Sujata.
Thank you, Sufai, and I also want to thank Henry Tai for inviting me to give this talk. Henry said he may not be able to be here today, so maybe that's why he may not be in town, he said. So when Henry sent me the email asking me if I would be willing to give this talk, I immediately said, yes, I would love to. And I was very excited. I was very happy that Angus Deaton had won the Nobel Prize. So I immediately said yes. And then as soon as I hit the submit button on my email, I said, oh dear, what have I signed up for? Because you get the Nobel Prize for a whole lifetime of work, and to have to now tell people about it means I need to now know exactly what Angus Deaton's lifetime of work has been. But I have read a lot of his work. I have read some of his work before as well, but I've read a lot of his work in the recent past, in just the last few days. I see a lot of you here are actually my students or my former students. I had not anticipated that. I thought I would get a much more broad audience. And so this is not a technical talk at all. It's just to give you a broad overview of what his work is about. So this is Angus. And the reason that I was very happy that he got the Nobel Prize is that many years ago, for 2 summers in a row, I was his research assistant. So Angus has been at Princeton University for many, many years now, and I was a new graduate student at Columbia University, which is in the city of New York, which is about a 2.5 hour train ride from the town of Princeton, which is where Angus lives and works. And just around the time I started as a PhD student, I got the opportunity to be his research assistant. And, as you can imagine, I was not a student at Princeton. I was a student at Columbia. He was a professor at Princeton. And so there were all these technical difficulties of how I was going to be his research assistant. As you can imagine, it's like if you wanted to be research assistant of somebody at Hong Kong U, maybe there would be rules about whether you can be their research assistant, how you could officially be on the payroll, whether you could be paid, et cetera, et cetera. Now, most people, I think, if they had the opportunity to be Angus's research assistant, would say, I don't need to be paid. What do I need to be paid for? So somebody figured this out, and they've worked out all the paperwork. And so this way I could officially be on the payroll at Princeton University, even though I was not a student there. And that meant I got paid for all the work that I did for Angus, which was really, at that point of time, very important to me. So I was Angus's RA, like I told you, and so I know him. When in October they announced that he was getting the Nobel Prize, I don't know if you know, but they announced the Nobel Prize, I think, on Swedish time, which is not Hong Kong time and is also not Princeton time. And my understanding is that they just, whenever they feel like they're going to make the announcement, they're going to do the press conference announcing it. I think an hour before that, they call up the winner. And it doesn't matter to them where the winner is or what time zone the winner is in, and just call them up and say, congratulations, you have won the Nobel Prize. So this happened. Well, the news broke. I don't know. I think Angus says he got the phone call at 6:10 a.m. Princeton time. At 8:30 p.m. Hong Kong time, on my phone, there was a New York Times flash that came up that said the 2015 Economics Nobel Prize goes to Angus Deaton. And I immediately jumped out of my chair and I said, oh my God, Angus has won the Nobel Prize. And then I found a friend of mine And this is 2015, right? So I found my friend in the virtual sense on WhatsApp, who used to be Angus's postdoc. And I said, have you heard Angus has won the Nobel Prize? And she said, yes, 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 I'm celebrating. So, yes, I'm celebrating as well. And so then we celebrated on WhatsApp. And then I said, let me figure it out. Okay, it's 8:30 p.m. in Hong Kong. That means it's 8:30 a.m. in Princeton. That means he must have just found out. And people have not yet quite, gotten to office probably. So maybe he's not yet bombarded by lots of congratulatory messages or congratulatory emails. So why don't I get my email in right now? Because if I send the email now, then maybe he'll still see it, right? And I might even get a reply. So at 8:30 in the evening, I sent him an email congratulating him. And later I went to bed and I woke up in the morning and I said, if I'm really lucky, he'll have seen my email and he'll have replied to me, but he hadn't. So then I checked with my friend and she said, no, I haven't heard either. Then a few days later, I checked with one of his graduate students. No, I haven't heard either. No, he actually got an automated reply that was meant for the press or something. So I think I caught him before he set up the auto reply, but I still didn't get a reply that morning. So I said, well, now I've lost my chance. Right? Now he's never going to see my email. Now I'm never going to get a reply. But still, I can tell you about his work. So let me tell you about Angus's work. Before that, let me tell you about Angus a bit. So Angus is Scottish. He was born in Scotland in 1945, and he is not, he doesn't come from a background of very educated people. His father, was a miner, and apparently was a very bright person, but had to drop out of school because back in the day, only one student per school was actually allowed to progress beyond a certain point. They just had this horrible quota system where you couldn't go beyond a certain point, and so he ended up being a miner, and they got drafted into the army, and so never at that stage hadn't completed his education. But then later, given how bright he was and given how interested he was in studying, he went back and went to night school and actually studied and became an engineer. So his father is truly a self-built man. Angus says his mother could never really understand what books were all about and why people got excited by them. But that is Angus's history, and Angus's father was very keen that his son have the opportunities that he himself did not have, and so persuaded apparently teachers to tutor him outside of school hours so that he could win a scholarship, which he used to go to a private school because they were not able to afford the fees of this private school. From that private school, he ended up going to Cambridge. He says he was slated to be a mathematician, but was very bored by mathematics, and ended up becoming an economist instead. And I think he has never looked back, because he became a full professor at the University of Bristol before the age of 30. He says in those days it was old to be 30 when you got to be a full professor. And he has been a professor at Princeton since 1983. And I read just yesterday that he's going to retire next year. So he'll have spent a good chunk of his career at Princeton. I think he's very loyal to Princeton, I can tell. So the Nobel Citation for Angus Deaton says that he got the Nobel Prize for his analysis of consumption, poverty, and welfare. And in particular, they say here are 3 questions that Angus has studied that really make him stand out. So the answers that he has given make him stand out. And these questions are, how do consumers distribute their spending among different goods? How much of society's income is spent and how much is saved? And how best do we measure and analyze welfare and poverty? Out of these 3 topics, really it's the third one that is more of a development economics area. And since I'm a development economist, that is the bulk of his work that I have read. And although I will tell you a bit about these 2 topics, I will spend more time talking about his work on poverty and welfare. Okay, so the first thing he won the Nobel Prize for is something known as the almost ideal demand system. So the way to think about the almost ideal demand system and why what he did was price-worthy is the following. So really the question is, what is the empirical relationship between prices, total expenditure, and average consumption? So as anybody who's taken standard micro knows, right, microeconomics, we think of the demand for a quantity, the quantity demanded of a good, yeah, by a household as a function of the prices of all the various goods. Imagine there's a list of goods, right? And each good has a price, so you can imagine a price vector. And for each of those goods, the quantity that you want to demand is going to be a function of the entire price vector, right? So not just that particular goods price, but all other prices, as well as the total amount of money you have to spend, which you can call consumption expenditure. So you can measure it either in terms of your income or in terms of how much you choose to spend. So that's what CH is. So really, this is nothing but a demand function by household H for good J. And if there are capital J goods, then there are capital J such equations, right? So that whole thing is called the demand system. And the question is, how do you estimate the demand system, right? So that's a notional demand system, but in the data, if you had to figure out what the demand system was, how would you go about doing it? And when you're doing that, you have to ask questions such as, are consumers behaving as if they were rational? So economists have these ideas that people are rational, that their preferences satisfy certain properties. So can you write the demand functions and estimate them in such a way that people end up looking like they're rational? Yeah? Or to put it a different way, you can use these to test if people are acting as if they are rational. Okay? But then you can also ask yourself the question, this is per household, how are you going to figure it out for the average, right? Because in the data, you can only estimate some moment of the distribution, right? So you can estimate the average, or you can estimate something like that, but you're not going to be able to estimate it for every single household. So where Angus fits into this literature is the following. So in 1969, Barton used a flexible, a more general form from what had been used before that, and he found that the estimates show that people are not rational. Okay, so if the estimates if you want them to make sense, then you have to assume that people are not making rational decisions. And Angus wrote a paper in 1974 saying, however, what you're finding in the data is also consistent with the fact that people might be rational, but maybe you are misspecifying the model. And in particular, maybe you're assuming functional forms that are too restrictive to capture patterns in real-world data. For example, he said, you're assuming that expenditure is linear in prices. So as prices go up, the total amount of money people spend on a good also goes up proportional to, in a constant proportion. And Muehlbauer, in two papers, 1975 and 76, introduced these other sorts of preferences which allow expenditure to be nonlinear in prices, and also allow different households to have different expenditure levels. In particular, they allow different households to differ on the basis of how many adult equivalents lived in the household. Okay? And also, these preferences allow straightforward aggregation so that you don't have a problem that you're not estimating the demand of the representative consumer. So using Muehlbauer's preferences, the ones that he introduced, led Deaton and Muehlbauer to write this paper called The Almost Ideal Demand System, which basically solves a problem in demand estimation that had not been solved until then, is also very easy to estimate and is sufficiently flexible that it allows you to test rationality. Okay? And although they themselves, the way they wrote the paper and the way they wrote a subsequent book about it, are not claiming that theirs is the last word on the subject, it led to a wide body of research to improve the specification of the model. So his contribution really is to take ideas that are grounded in theory and then convert them into methodologies that can be used very easily so that people are able to test theories in the data. And this is, I think, a general theme across all the work that he has done. And this is an example of that. So the almost ideal demand system continues to be the basis of systems used today in a variety of applications. So that is the almost ideal demand system. The other thing he worked on, or the other thing that the Nobel Citation says it is awarding him the Nobel Prize for is looking at how consumption varies over time. Okay? So to think about how consumption varies over time, a useful place to start is to think about the permanent income hypothesis. So the permanent income hypothesis, which is due to Friedman, 1956 and 57, basically, in a nutshell, says the following. Sorry, I just wanted to show you. Never mind. It tells you that individuals consume permanent income, but they save the transitory component. So here's how to think about it. Imagine that you're a household and you're trying to figure out how much money to spend on consumption in this period. You know that you're going to live multiple periods, right? So you don't need to just make snapshot decisions on the basis of your income this period. You can be looking at the sum of the total flows of income you're going to receive over your entire lifetime, let's say, and then figure out how much you want to consume. That makes sense, right? So if this is what people do, then when incomes change over time, right? Incomes change over time due to two different reasons, let's say. One is there could be a permanent shock, a permanent increase in your income. The other is there could be a transitory shock in your income. And the idea is that over your lifetime, all the transitory shocks, which we assume are random and therefore have mean zero, okay, are random and have mean zero, will even out. So they'll cancel out. So transitory components are not going to change your permanent income. So it shouldn't affect your consumption because your consumption should be responding just to the permanent income, the sum of your incomes that you're going to earn. Yeah? So what people should be doing is they should be consuming out of the permanent income, and transitory components or transitory shocks to their income should just be saved and then dissaved. Okay? So that's what the permanent income hypothesis says. And if that is true, then what you see in the data should also be what you should see in the data, which is that consumption over time should be smoother than income is over time, right? Because income fluctuates a lot, but some part of that is transitory, so you shouldn't respond to that in your consumption. So your consumption should respond more smoothly. That's what people used to think. This is what people used to see in the data, and this is what they thought the reason was for that. Until Deaton came along in 1987 and said, but you're wrong about the income shocks. And he says income shocks actually themselves have a permanent component to them. And what he means by that is that if a person's income receives a shock, it also means the next period is also going to be higher. Okay, so if your income goes up today, your income day after tomorrow is also going to be higher, even though maybe the second period won't be as big as it was today. So there's actually a permanent component to income shocks themselves. So they don't just even out. If they don't just even out, then when I receive an income shock, then I am expecting now my permanent income to be higher. So my consumption should be higher. Yeah? So then consumption over time should be more volatile than income because I'm actually anticipating future increases in income as well, right? So it should be more volatile than my income is. But the problem is it's not in the data, right? So what he did was he took a simple sort of empirical observation about what income shocks tend to be like, and he took them to the theory, and then he figured out that the theory doesn't match the data. Yeah? So this came to be known as the Deaton paradox. So then the question is, what do you do with the Deaton paradox? How do you make sense of the Deaton paradox? And so you can explain it using different arguments. One explanation is that consumers are not rational. Another argument is that there's some problem with going from a household to what you should see in the data on average. But a third argument is that maybe there are borrowing constraints. So this is the argument that Deaton put forward in 1991 in a paper that he wrote, where he said that maybe what is happening is that people are not able to consume above their income, their current income, because they're not able to borrow. So people face borrowing constraints, and maybe that's why in the data, consumption ends up looking smoother than income. Okay, so I don't think this is necessarily the last word on the subject, but once again, I think work that he did started off a very large literature where people began to take borrowing constraints much more seriously than they used to before. And in particular, I think in macroeconomics, this kind of work has been very influential. So even though Deaton is not a macroeconomist, nowadays, if you look at macroeconomics, it's all micro-founded. Macroeconomists start by assuming preferences of households or behavior of households, and then build up and are very careful when they think about aggregation, and are often also assuming that people face borrowing constraints. Okay, so that is his work on consumption over time. I should mention that I'm happy to take questions at any time you have any. I may not have the answers to your questions, but I'm happy to take the questions anyway. Okay, so if you feel like asking me one, please go ahead. The other thing he got his prize for was his work on poverty. And this is actually work that I'm very interested in, so I'm going to spend some time, a little bit more time talking about it. Okay, so if I can move forward. So basically, this is an interesting question, right? How many people in the world are poor? This is an interesting question from the policy point of view, for sure. Yeah. Even for individuals, so for international policy, it's an important question. Even for national policy, it's an important question. Even for local policy, it's an important question. So lots of people want to know the answer to this question, but then how do you answer it? Okay? So the way that economists do it is we use these things called poverty lines. What are poverty lines? Poverty lines are basically, conceptually, a threshold where we assume that if people have income at this threshold or above this threshold, then they will have access to goods and services that will allow them to be non-poor. Yeah? And if they have income below this threshold, then they will not be able to have access to enough goods and services to be non-poor. So that's what a poverty line is. And then you can say, but how do you know what the poverty line is, right? And so that is, a lot of people have to work very hard to figure out or to estimate a poverty line or to come up with construct a poverty line. A lot of countries, a lot of developing countries in particular, they ground their poverty lines in nutritional requirements. So the idea is that the starkest form of poverty is when you cannot afford enough to eat. So at the basic minimum, everybody needs to have a certain amount of access to calories. So let's figure out what those calories are, how many calories those should be, and then let's figure out how much income it takes to buy those calories. And then, there might also be additional needs that people have of food and shelter, so maybe we need to also add those in. Okay, so in many developing countries, these are nutritionally grounded poverty lines. Once you've agreed on a poverty line for a country, let's say, then what you need to do is you need to take data and figure out how many people in the economy's income is below, or consumption, let's say, is below this poverty line. People who are below the poverty line, you're going to call them poor, and then you have to do, basically you have to construct something called a head count ratio. You just add up all the people who are poor, so you do a head count, right? And then you just divide it by the total number of people in the population, and you call that a head count ratio. So when you look at poverty numbers, basically people are, for the most part, talking about head count ratios. Now, the question here is, what data are you going to use to see if somebody is poor or not? Okay? There are choices that you have to make there. So for example, you could use national accounts data. So the same statistical bureaus in governments that are collecting data on GDP, right, will also be able to tell you how much consumption, what consumption level is in your economy. So if you take total GDP and you subtract from that intermediate consumption and you subtract from that government expenditure and also exports minus imports, what you're left with as a residual is consumption. Yeah? So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is to actually do household surveys and to go and ask people in their houses how much money they spend on consumption. And if you get the right number there, right, it should be exactly equal to what you get from the national accounts. In principle, that's true, right? So in principle, it shouldn't matter which of these two data sources you use. But of course, in reality, it does matter. Okay? So Deaton has done a lot of work trying to explain why it is that poverty numbers end up looking so different depending on whether you use national accounts data, whether you use household surveys data, and where are the errors creeping in. Okay? And basically, the message of his work is that neither of these is perfect. There are reasons to think that this is wrong. There are also reasons to think that this is wrong. And so you have to be careful when you think about, you have to be very careful when you estimate poverty, because you need to really be careful and always make sure to put in the caveats that your results are sensitive to these errors. Now, another thing that Deaton has worked on is purchasing power parities for the poor. So many of you may have heard about PPPs, which are purchasing power parities, right? But Angus actually went and constructed PPPPs, which are purchasing power parities for the poor. The idea there is when you are comparing, suppose you want to compare poverty numbers across different countries. So you want to know are more people poor as a fraction of the population, yeah? Are more people poor in Mali than they are in Bangladesh, let's say. Yeah? So suppose you want to ask a question like that, then you need to be able to figure out the head count ratio in both of these countries and then compare it. But then you need to have poverty lines in the two countries that are comparable. But of course, the problem is people in Mali are buying and doing things in their currency, and people in Bangladesh are doing things in their currency, and these are not equivalent. So you have to figure out a price index that's going to allow you to compare these two things. Now, we know as I teach my students, those of you who are sitting here, that exchange rates are a very bad idea, right? And so people often use what are called purchasing power parities. But purchasing power parities were not constructed with the view to comparing poverty numbers. And the reason that matters is that purchasing power parities are indices that use as weights a basket of goods and services that people are buying, but in that basket of goods and services might be some goods and services that poor people never buy. And so differences in different countries might be coming from just these particular goods, which really matter not at all to poor people. And so we should be perhaps constructing better indices, which is what these purchasing power parities for the poor are. I won't spend too much time on that. What else has Angus worked on? Is there any more? Here we go. Okay, here is an important question. So for some reason or the other, Angus has done a lot of work on India. So I was reading some news article that claims that he's always had a love affair with India. And if you read his memoir, he says that the reason he's always been fascinated with India is that as a child, he used to read about, so as a child growing up, he says, in grey and rainy Scotland and in England, he always was very fascinated by this tropical country somewhere out there where I suppose he thought it never rained. So maybe that's the reason. But he's done a lot of work on India. And I think Indian policy has truly benefited from the interest that he has taken in India. So here's an interesting and a very important question. As you probably know, India instituted economic reforms in the early 1990s. Yeah? And that's really when the Indian growth rate, GDP growth rate, took off. So the question is, did poverty go down when GDP per capita increased in India? Okay? Now it turns out that that's not you would think that's an easy question to answer if you had the data, but it turns out it's not an easy question to answer. And why is that? That is because there's a problem with the surveys. So let me tell you about surveys. By the way, when I was Angus's RA, the first thing he did was he gifted me a book he had written called Analysis of Household Surveys. And this is basically a textbook he wrote teaching people how to take household surveys and use Stata, which I didn't know at the time, but I had to learn in order to be his RA, to do things like this, okay? To estimate poverty, to estimate inequality, and do all kinds of analysis with survey data, which basically up until that point nobody was ever taught how to do in a standard course. Okay. So he has spent a lot of time poring over surveys, looking at survey design, looking at the raw data, and so on and so forth. And so he's taken a lot of interest in this particular problem that happened in India in the late 1990s. Now here is the story. So India has something called the National Sample Survey Organization, which is a sort of semi-autonomous body whose job it is to conduct these household surveys. Now they conduct something called a thick round every 5 to 6 years, where they do a very large nationally representative survey. And so if you happen to be one of the households that's selected by the NSSO, then they will show up in your house with an extremely long questionnaire and ask you lots of very detailed questions about, can you tell me how much you bought of such and such good and how much money you spent on it, for a very, very long list of things. Okay, food items as well as non-food items. I'm just telling you about the consumption surveys. They also do employment surveys and so on and so forth. So now, when you ask somebody a question like that, you also have to tell them over which period you want the answer, right? So I might say, can you tell me how much money you spent on milk? But then you will say how much money I spent on milk when. So I might say, can you tell me how much money you spent on milk in the last 30 days? Yeah, so that's the recall period. Now, from time to time, the NSSO used to experiment with different recall periods. They wanted to see if the answers would change substantially, obviously, if you all standardized it, whether you got different answers if you used different recall periods. So in the thin rounds that they used to do, in between the thick rounds, yeah, those thin rounds are annual, they would experiment. So they would, to some randomly chosen households, they would ask with one recall period, some other randomly chosen households, they would ask with a different recall period, and they were just trying to learn how these things matter. And then in 1999-2000, when it was time for them to do a thick round, the 55th thick round, there was a big internal debate apparently, and they decided that they were going to ask for high-frequency items. So milk is a good example of a high-frequency item. Both questions with the 7-day recall period as well as questions with the 30-day recall period for exactly the same items. Okay, and ask those questions to exactly the same households. So, the same households were asked to report high-frequency items with 7 as well as 30-day recall. And the way that they did it was they put two adjacent columns, okay, so one for the 7-day recall and one for the 30-day recall on the same page of the questionnaire. Now, this turned out to be a huge problem. Because imagine now that you were a household or you were an investigator, yeah? And you're trying to answer these two questions. The minute you start writing it down, or even the minute you start giving an answer, you're going to try to make these answers consistent. Right? So whatever you say for 7 days, you're going to probably multiply by about 4 to give an answer for 30. And so whatever value there was in using two different recall periods is instantly lost. That's one problem. But the other problem is because they had never done this in the previous surveys. In the previous surveys, people were basically using the 30-day recall period. This survey round is now non-comparable. You cannot use the data here and compare them with the other data. So if the question is, did poverty go down? You really want to measure changes over time. You've just basically shot yourself in the foot here, right? So then the problem is, how do you actually go about doing this? So then, of course, lots of different economists came about with solutions to this problem. Okay, so let's fix it in this way, let's fix it in that way, and that led to a huge controversy over whether poverty had declined and how much poverty had declined in the 1990s during the fastest economic growth India has had for a very long period. So one of the things that Deaton and Dres did, and Tarodzi, who is his student, also did, is they tried to fix it using the fact that the 55th round retained 30-day recall for some items, which actually turned out to be highly correlated with total expenditure. And so they used just those items to measure trends. So they're saying, let's assume that this whole mess didn't affect these items, yeah? And that the trend, once again, the trend, let's assume, is going to be the same if we look at these items versus the other items. So let's use these to figure out the trends. So they did this. Not everybody agrees with them that this is the right way to do it, so there are different estimates, like I told you, but let me tell you what Deaton and Dres found. They also did this other paper where they used different price indices, but let's not worry about that right now. And this is what they found. So these are the official counts, okay? And these are the counts that Deaton and Dres got in their 2002 paper. So these are done from thick rounds. These are the thin rounds, and this is just to show you that the thin rounds are a bit weird, so you shouldn't really believe the data from there. Here what they find is, this is 1987-88, this is 1993-94, and then this is 1999-2000. here they find actually that poverty appears to have declined faster than the official estimate. Okay, so in the first half of the 1990s, but then in the second half of the 1990s, they found that poverty seems to have declined slower than the official estimate. Okay, so this was their contribution to this debate. Now, here's something that's a bit strange. So, I told you that I had the opportunity to be Angus's research assistant when I just started off as a PhD student at Columbia. And the reason I had this opportunity was Jean Drèze. Okay, so Angus and Drèze were planning to work together, okay? And I guess I knew Angus. I'm not really sure if I knew Angus, but Angus knew who my father was. Okay? And the reason Angus knew who my father was is that my father was the chairman of the governing council of the National Sample Survey Organization in the late 90s, in the mid to the late 1990s. And I think if my father had said to me, "You're going to Columbia, why don't you go and ask Angus if you could be his research assistant?" I would have said no. Because I was very proud, and so there was no way that I was going to allow my father to recommend that I be Angus's research assistant. But my father didn't suggest it, but Jean suggested it. Jean said, why don't I ask Angus if you can be his research assistant? And so I said, yes, of course, I would love to be his research assistant. And so then he asked, and Angus said yes, and that's how I ended up being his RA. So I actually don't know if my father is responsible for this flub. My guess is he is not responsible for this flub, but I no longer have the opportunity to ask him. So this is how I ended up working with Angus. And the first data, the only data I worked with Angus was actually the National Sample Survey data, and he asked me to estimate poverty for various different Indian states, and he taught me how to do this. So that's basically what I did with Angus the first summer that I was working with him. And Angus actually says, so Princeton is a really beautiful campus, and I would go there all the way from New York. It would take me 3 hours to get there, and then I would go into this beautiful office, which I shared with many other PhD students. And this was in the summer, and Princeton would be a really quiet place. Not many people would be around. You would walk in these corridors and you would see these names on these doors and you would say, oh my God. And then you say, oh my God. But the thing is, the doors would always be closed. There would be nobody. So you never actually see these people. But you knew that you were in the midst of greatness. And Angus actually says in his memoir that he's never actually known how to use research assistants. So what I would do is I would meet him once a week, and he taught me lots of stuff about how to analyze data, yeah? But at the end of the summer, I was not completely convinced that he really needed me to do this work. Because I think he could have done it very easily all on his own and probably a little bit quicker. But he still kind of put up with me, and he allowed me to do this. And in the process, I think I benefited. So I think sometimes really great people, they do things for junior people that they probably don't even remember and maybe don't even think about so much, but I think they do huge favors to junior people that I think junior people benefit from for the rest of their lives. So I think Angus is one of those people who does these things without really necessarily spending too much time thinking about them. The next summer, I was his research assistant again, and that summer I was definitely convinced that he didn't need my help. But he still put up with me, and he made sure I got paid. And he did something else which was very, very nice, which is that he wrote a letter to the head of my department saying that even though I had failed my qualifying exams, I should please be allowed a second chance to take them, which I was going to be allowed anyway. But that I didn't really deserve to fail, and so they shouldn't take away my stipend. And I think that is something that I will never forget, because what happened in the middle, in the sort of in between the two summers, what had happened is my father had fallen very sick. We didn't know what was wrong with him. Angus was instrumental in helping me track down doctors in New York City who would look at his medical records so that we could try and figure out what was happening to him. My father had subsequently died. I had taken my qualifying exams 2 months after he had died, and I had failed them, and I was convinced that I was going to be thrown out of Columbia. And I didn't know what I was going to do if I was going to be thrown out of Columbia. And I don't know if, I did subsequently take them, and I did pass, and it was all, no extra favors had to be, thankfully, were required. But just the fact that Angus was there made me feel like there was somebody out there who was watching out for me so that, things couldn't get, I think things could have gotten really bad if they had gotten really bad, but at least there was somebody who cared. Okay? And in the absence of anybody like that at Columbia, I still felt very, very grateful that there was somebody at Princeton who cared about me. So I think Angus has been really influential in my life in a way that has intersected between the professional and the personal, which is why it's sometimes very hard for me to be objective when I try to think about his Nobel Prize. Let me now move on to tell you about some other work that Deaton has done, Angus has done. He's looked at inequality. He's also found that inequality has increased in India at the same time as poverty has declined. He has also spent a lot of time thinking about poverty and malnutrition in India. So India is a strange case again in this other respect, which is that in the 1990s, we have witnessed, and in the early 2000s, we have witnessed both an increase in per capita expenditure, which is what you should expect if incomes are going up, right? And a decline in calorie consumption. Now, this decline in calorie consumption has apparently been found even in China, okay, with increases in per capita income. But what is strange about India is that India has extremely high malnutrition rates. So 50 to 55% of children were below 2 standard deviations on height for age and weight for age. And there are doubts about whether malnutrition has declined at all between 1998, 99, and 2004, 2005, 2006, between these two subsequent rounds of something called the National Family Health Survey. Although, of course, there is evidence, very clear evidence, that over this longer time horizon, malnutrition has declined. So the question is, what is going on here? Okay? And they have spent, Deaton and Rez have spent a lot of time trying to figure out what is going on. They have found that this decline in calorie consumption is occurring mostly at high income levels or high per capita expenditure levels. So it's the richer people who are decreasing their calorie consumption more. But also, you would think that people substitute away from cereals to other goods, right? People are searching for diversity in their diets. But they find it's not just a decline in cereals, it's also a decline in consumption of fats and proteins, and that it cannot be attributed to an increase in the price of food or calories relative to other goods. And so their preferred explanation, although they are very careful to say that they don't know for sure, is that maybe calorie requirements have declined. Okay? Either due to better health, because there is higher vaccination rates, there is better sanitation, and so on and so forth, or because of lower activity levels, because maybe people are not having to work as hard as they used to have to work, as wages have increased. But also, they point out that calorie intake doesn't tell us everything we need to know about nutrition. We should also be looking at all of these other things: vitamins, minerals, fats, diversity of diets, and breastfeeding practices. And that anthropometric measures tell us a confusing story about what's happening to malnutrition in India. A very careful analysis of what is happening to malnutrition in India along with economic growth. Okay? So he's very careful to point out that although poverty decline has perhaps in the early part of the 1990s been faster than official headcounts, it is still not as high as is warranted by the rate of economic growth. Or even though maybe what is happening, so some people in India have argued that actually people are getting more and more malnourished as economic growth takes place because price of food has increased so much that poor people are just not being able to afford food. And they show very carefully in the data that that is not what is going on. But at the same time, he's also very careful to point out that the malnutrition rates in India are incredibly high, given that it is a middle-income country. There are some sub-Saharan African countries that have better malnutrition rates than India does, and that that is a cause of worry. So in his own memoir, Angus describes himself as being interested in puzzles and paradoxes. Because what he has, like I said, and like Albert and I were discussing the other day, he has taken theory and has then gone and checked for what this implies in the data, and then when it doesn't match what is found in the data, he's tried to figure out what is wrong, either in the theory or in the data. And so the way he describes it is, he says it's a murky world out there, and really what I want to do is I just want to try and understand what makes it work. Here is his approach, as stated in his memoir again. He says, when he was young, when he was still at Cambridge, he said, I understood that economics was about three things: theory that specified mechanisms and stories about how the world worked and how things might be linked together, evidence that could be interpreted in terms of the theory or that just seemed to contradict it or was just puzzling, and writing. He says the importance of which is most understated, much understated in economics. So those of you who are here and are my students and have a report to submit next week, I hope you're listening. You have to write in a way that can explain mechanisms in a way that make them compelling, or that can draw out the lessons that we'll learn from the combination of theory and evidence. Okay? So this is his approach to all of his work. And the last thing I want to talk about with respect to the work that he has done, even though this is not in the Nobel Citation, but I think is an area where he has made an important contribution, is his work on empirical methods in development. So what he says is, well, he doesn't say this. This is what I am saying, but then I'll tell you what he says. In a lot of applied economics, what we want to do is we want to uncover mechanisms, right? We want to try and understand what is causing what, right? Because that can help us understand how development can come about, or how we can change policy, for example. For example, and this is a question that Angus asks in one of his recent papers, does foreign aid increase economic growth? If you want to ask that question, you could just look at the correlation between foreign aid, right, the volume of foreign aid going to different countries and the rate at which these countries' GDP per capita is growing, but you have to immediately confront the fact that these things are simultaneously determined, right? So it could be that when a country receives foreign aid, it grows faster, but it could also be that it's the slower growing countries that receive the foreign aid. That seems logical also, right? So how do you really know what is happening here? A lot of people have used instrumental variables. Now with instrumental variables, he says, there's a big confusion in the literature on what instrumental variables are. And the way that instrumental variables actually started off being used is you started with a model of how the world worked, right? And then you were not able to identify a parameter, and so then you used some other variable that is exogenous as an instrument that would allow you to identify the parameter that you were interested in. But he says nowadays in empirical work, what people are doing is they are using things that are external but are not exogenous, and that these two things are actually completely different things. So external in his example, so I was reading this paper by him, 2010 I think it was. So he's using this example of whether building a railway station in China is going to reduce poverty. Okay, so in a particular province, if you build a railway station, is that going to reduce poverty? Of course, there's a problem of simultaneity, which is that maybe the government is going to build railway stations in places where poverty might decline more, right? So that you're not able to identify the true causal parameter. So he says people use something that is external. Like you could use the fact that the government is randomly, or for some reason, government has chosen that particular areas are going to be in some kind of development zone, infrastructure development zone, and that's where the railway stations are more likely to be built, right? These things you could argue maybe have nothing to do with whether they were poor or not. Let's say that's true. Yeah? Then they are external. But he says they're not necessarily exogenous, because to be exogenous, you have to be able to claim that it's not, whether that province ends up being in that infrastructure development zone has nothing to do with how poverty is going to evolve in that province. That's what exogeneity means. And he says, in a lot of empirical work, people confuse these two things, but they are not actually the same thing. Now, the other thing that a lot of economists, and then he says there is this problem of heterogeneity effects. You find different effects if you cut on different variables, and that is treated as a technical problem, but really it's a symptom of the fact that we don't understand what's going on behind these things. And then he talks about the move to randomized controlled trials. So a lot of development economists use randomized controlled trials, field experiments, because you're frustrated with the idea that there is all this simultaneity going on. So just like in medicine, if you want to know if a particular drug is going to cure a particular disease or not, you just randomize who gets it and who doesn't get it, and then you can compare the prevalence or the incidence of the disease between the people who don't get the medicine and who do get the medicine. And the fact that it is randomized buys you the causality, basically, right? He says, in the ideal experiment, that is true. But in the real world, he says, most experiments are not like that. And he says these tools are not magic. And that the RCTs that are being done of what works cannot help us understand these things unless we know why they work. In a recent article that he wrote, after he got the Nobel Prize, he says, I worry too that experiments are technical solutions to political problems. So putting in a program and randomizing it and finding that as a result of that, kids go to school more or kids' test scores improve or something like that, he says, are technical solutions, but often these are political problems. And when you actually scale these things up and you actually try and convert these into policy, you're going to run into many other problems that these experiments are actually not answering at all. And he also says that the fact that experiments are often done on the poor and not by the poor is hardly an encouraging sign. So I've just given you a snapshot, a whirlwind tour, if you like, of some of the things that Angus has done. He has worked on many other things as well. But really, I don't think 1 hour is enough to talk about everything that he has contributed to. I think as a person, or as an economist, let me put it that way, Angus is one of those people who is not faddish. He doesn't just go with whatever is the latest fashion in the field. He has always worked on things that interested him and has taken his time and is extremely prolific, but also is not terribly bothered by sort of external ideas of whether you are publishing in the best journal or how many publications you have had in the last year and so on and so forth. So, as economists, I think, those of us here who are academic economists, there are many economists whose work you can admire, but there are not that many economists whom you can admire as people. And for me, I think Angus is one of those people whose work I admire and whose person I admire at the same time. So I'm extremely thrilled that he won the Nobel Prize this year. And I told him this in the email that I told you. I wrote to him at 8:30 at night that I didn't get a reply to the next morning until 3 weeks later, I did get a reply. And the reply that I got was personalized. It was written to me. And it was written with me in mind. He wasn't sending a form email to everybody who had written to congratulate him. And I think, once again, that is a measure of the man that I don't know how many hundreds of emails this man must have received. But he took his time, but then he actually wrote me, a full email thanking me for the congratulations that I had sent him. So I really could not be happier about this year's Nobel Prize. Thank you for coming, and thank you for listening to my talk.
I was wondering something about what you said in the RCT part, and you talked something like some of the political problems cannot be solved by the experiments, and I wonder if there are some examples that you could elaborate on that point.
that policymakers play an extremely important role, and it's a lot of these policymakers play an extremely important role, but also that democratic processes can help to point towards the right policies. Okay? So, for example, I don't know if this is going to answer your question directly, but maybe it will. So he talks about I don't know if you know about Progresa. So Progresa is in Mexico. It was this huge intervention where the government decided that it was going to provide conditional cash transfers. So households, poor households, were going to receive money from the government if they took their kids to health clinics or if they took their kids to school. It was a cash transfer from the government, but it was conditional on particular changes in your behavior. Okay? And this is widely considered to have been a huge success. And what's more, they randomized it. So they did it randomly in some areas and not in other areas, which has allowed people to evaluate it. And when they say it's a huge success, this is really grounded in evidence. Now, if you talk to the person who set up Progresa in Mexico, he says, so apparently lots of other countries have emulated. They've learned from what has happened in Progresa and have emulated it and have set it up in many other developing countries. But if you ask the person who set it up in Mexico himself, he says that he doesn't recommend that countries just blindly go and copy what has been done in Mexico. Because if you don't have the right context for it, if you don't have the right political will for it, if you're going to start requiring that kids go to school or that kids go to health clinics before their parents can receive the transfer, but if you don't have people in the health clinics to actually treat these children when they come there or weigh them or vaccinate them or whatever, then this program is clearly not going to be a success. So you can transplant a conditional any experiment into a new setting, but you're not going to succeed at it unless you are able to replicate everything, right? Including the political will to make something like that work. The other problem, of course, that Angus points out is that context matters very much. So what works in Mexico may not work somewhere else, and there could be a bunch of reasons why. And so if you're spending all your effort in an RCT just to figure out that CCTs work without figuring out why they work, then you're never going to be able to, then you're going to be very limited in how much you learn from this, right? Because what we really want to know is why it works, so that we can then replicate that somewhere else instead of just knowing that this particular experiment worked in this area. So yeah, that's part of his critique.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, we thank Sujata again.
Thank you.
Thank you.